Let's dive right into Rogério Lorenzo's framework. It proposes a pretty fundamental realignment in how we should be thinking about numerical cognition. The core argument here is that counting and reading, well, they aren't separate faculties at all. Instead, they're just two poles of a single unified cognitive act, what he terms the alphanumeric technology of image.
So, the whole framework kicks off by tackling a really foundational, almost phenomenological problem. What actually is the structural difference between a word, say apple, and a number like 3? Lorenzo's position is that the apparent autonomy of a number is really just an illusion, and understanding its true, dependent structure, that's the key to this entire model.
The entire analysis is driven by this core concept, the idea that there is a structural asymmetry inside the numeral itself. He models this in what he calls the phonological discursive matrix. And it's this foundational tension that explains why numerals feel so autonomous, even when structurally they're anything but.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, right? This matrix formalizes that tension perfectly. Think about it. When you say the word 3, it sounds done. It has a complete prosodic contour. It feels finished. Lorenzo calls this the phonological trap. And it's a powerful one, giving us this gut feeling that the number is a complete standalone thing. But discursively, in terms of meaning, it's totally incomplete. It's a predicate that's just begging for a complement. You're always left with the question, 3 of what? And that gap, that friction between the complete sound and the incomplete meaning, that's the engine driving this whole framework.
And this brings us to their formal linguistic status. Numerals are, for all intents and purposes, functionally syntagogrammatic. You could call them bound roots. They have the phonological independence of a root word, sure, but they remain constitutively dependent in discourse. Their meaning absolutely requires other elements to be intelligible.
So, how does the system resolve this tension? The framework proposes a formal mechanism, the null position, or N0. Think of it as the invisible structural slot that anchors every single numeral, making its discursive function possible in the first place.
The whole idea of the null position really rests on 3 pillars. First, it's our cognitive default. Every numeral has to govern an instance, so it effectively needs a place to land, and that's this N0 slot. Second, cognitive technologies, like the meta-image, which we'll get to in a bit, they help make this invisible ground tangible. And third, N0 is really the ultimate refutation of numeral autonomy. A numeral without it is just, well, it's an incomplete form, a perceptual failure.
And this is just a brilliant way to illustrate the dynamic, drawing a parallel with Gestalt psychology. The numeral itself acts as the figure. It's a bounded, completed whole, kind of like the perfective aspect in linguistics. The instance it governs, on the other hand, is the ground, that ongoing, unfolding process, more like the imperfective aspect. And because the ground is experientially invisible, we end up focusing only on the figure, on the numeral itself, and we mistake its visibility for the entire mathematical act.
Now, this idea of inherent dependency isn't just some abstract theoretical construct. It connects directly to established linguistic typology, specifically to Martin Haspelmath's work on clitics. Viewing the numeral as a clitic gives us a really powerful existing theoretical lens to understand how it functions. So, as Haspelmath defines it, a clitic is a bound morph that's not quite an affix and not quite a root. The key thing is it can't stand alone. It requires a host to be meaningful. You can see how this maps perfectly onto that discursive dependence we were just talking about in the phonological discursive matrix.
So what's the crucial difference here, according to Haspelmath? It all comes down to selectivity. Affixes are picky. They only attach to specific word classes. You know, a Latin genitive suffix only sticks to nouns, that's it. But clitics, they're not selective at all. Think about the English possessives s. You can attach it to a noun, sure, but also to an adverb, even a whole phrase. And this is exactly how numerals behave. They act just like these non-selective clitics. They can latch onto and quantify pretty much any conceptual host you throw at them.
This allows us to reframe this entire concept. We're moving away from any notion of parasitism and towards seeing this relationship as one of tool dependency. The numeral is a cognitive tool, plain and simple. And like any tool, its function is defined by how it's applied to a host material or concept. This really aligns perfectly with a cognitive technologies perspective. This reframing gives us a direct test for autonomy. So if a numeral is a clitic, can 3 really exist without a host? The answer has to be no, right? A numeral 3 just sitting on a blank whiteboard is as grammatically incomplete as a floating apostrophe, S. What happens is our minds instantly and invisibly supply a host, that null position.
Okay, so with that mechanism in place, we can now really start to deconstruct the illusion of mathematical Platonism. The framework identifies a very specific cognitive process, the triple conflation, that produces this feeling that numbers pre-exist, that they're autonomous entities.
It's basically a three-step phenomenological slide, a series of subtle category errors. First, we notice a modal inevitability. Inside a given system, 3 has to refer to 3 things. That's just a structural property. Second, this sense of inevitable kind of slides into a feeling of temporal latency, as if 3-ness is just dormant, waiting to be used. And finally, that feeling of waiting slides into a full-blown claim of ontological preexistence, that the number must have existed before any act of counting.
And that's the core philosophical mistake. The framework argues that we mistake a posterior property of a stable system, its inevitability, for a previous status, its preexistence. The illusion of autonomy is really just us misreading a tool's consistent function. Now, this isn't just a theoretical model. It finds some pretty powerful empirical validation in an analysis of student work from the Brazilian Mathematics Olympiad for public schools, or OBMEP. And this is where we see the concept of the meta-image really come to life. So what is a meta-image? It's not just a collection of different modes like text, numbers, and pictures. It's defined as a single, unified discursive operation where all those elements, verbal, numerical, visual, are integrated together to produce mathematical meaning. It's one cognitive technology, not 3 separate ones working in parallel.
And the OBMEP corpus shows that high-scoring students are constantly, spontaneously creating these meta-images. They use this really unsystematic and ad hoc mix of language, symbols, and little diagrams. And this totally challenges the way we teach, where math and language are often kept separate. Their accuracy comes from mastering these conceptual relationships, which proves that mathematical rigor isn't about formal isolation. It's about this rich alphanumeric integration.
So when we synthesize all these components, the matrix, the N0, the clitic model, and this meta-image, we end up with a new and really powerful analytical tool, the framework of counting and reading as a single alphanumeric technology of image. This matrix really shows off the framework's analytical power. Look at how it systematically just dissolves 5 key dichotomies that have fragmented math education for so long. Take reading versus counting. They're not separate. They converge as unified cognitive acts within the meta-image. Numbers just become discursive operators in a shared symbolic continuum. Or look at formal versus informal. We see students using everyday language and their own ad hoc notation, creating this dynamic space for reasoning where getting the concept right is more important than perfect formal rigor. These aren't oppositions, they're integrated parts of a single practice. So, let's wrap up with the key contributions of this model. First, it unifies reading and counting into a single cognitive technology. Second, it gives us the precise cognitive mechanism, that N0 and the figure/ground dynamic, that explains the illusion of autonomy. Third, it deconstructs Platonism as a systematic category error. Fourth, it correctly reframes dependency as an essential feature of cognitive tools, not some kind of flaw. And finally, it offers a really robust analytical method that's grounded in both discursive anthropology and formal linguistics. And all of this leaves us with a final guiding question. By making these structural dependencies visible, by revealing the N0, the host-clitic bond, the meta-image, we're really forced to ask, what does mathematics actually look like when its tools are no longer invisible?